Good morning, my little duckies. It is I, Mrs. Hawley. I'm hoping you're having a good day. Here's what we are going to do today. Looks like we're going to look at sources. So the question is, how is evidence from sources used to construct what happened in the past? So we're going to learn the terms associated with sourcing, and we're going to be able to tell the difference between primary and secondary sources. So hopefully you've got your split screen up, you've got this presentation playing on one side, and you've got your workbook open on the other. I'd like you to go to page 12, slide 12 in your workbook. No homework, yay. All right, so everybody should be on slide 12. Let's get this party started, shall we? All right, you can't type on this slide, but I want you to think. If you wanted to conduct research on the Loch Ness Monster, what kind of source or sources would you use? Think about that just for a second or two. What kind of sources would you use? Well, what do you think? What kind of sources would you use? I might use pictures, photographs that other people have taken of the Loch Ness Monster. I maybe would, I know a lot of people have been using super duper crazy kinds of underwater cameras. I might talk to those people and look at their film. I might look at stories online of people who thought they saw the Loch Ness Monster. So there's lots of different kinds of sources that you could look at. But sourcing is very important in studying history. You've got to know what kind of source you're looking at and look at whether there's reliability there. Is the person biased? All those nifty things we're going to talk about. Okay, let's go. I like that flippy thing it's doing. All right, sourcing. Oh, it did it again. All right, you're going to fill in the notes. Sourcing is where you look at where a source came from in order to try to understand it. And a lot of time, what you do is you figure out the sourcing before you read a document. So anytime you get a document to read, and you are going to read documents all year long, really the first thing you should do is look at whether or not there's a source listed, either on the top or on the bottom of underneath the source, the reading. Figure out, who is it? Who are they? Have you heard of him before or her? What do you know about that person? Did they tend to take one side in an issue or another side? Because that can tell you a lot about their point of view and whether or not that source is reliable or usable. Okay. So when historians source documents, they look at just what I said. Who is the author? They look at when it was created, if there's a date or it's an event, because that can tell you a lot about what they're talking about too. If you can recognize the time period or the date, that can tell you a lot. All right? Why was the source created? Was it created to get people to think a certain way about an event or topic? Was it created to educate people about an event? So why? Why was it created? And then what is the purpose of this document? Is it to inform? Okay, is it to persuade? All right. So these two, the why and the purpose, are very, very closely related. So think about that, these thoughts when you're looking at documents. Okay. Oops. All right. When sourcing a document, historians look at making predictions about what they might read, and that's based on who wrote it. Okay, if they see what the source is or who the source is, we as historians look for bias. Bias when you feel strongly about one particular idea over another, you favor it and you want everyone else to favor it, then you might be biased. So we look at whether or not we can trust the document as being reliable, because that's important also. Okay. All right, we're going on to page 13 in your workbook. So take a look at page 13. Going to look at different kinds. Oh, we just did that. I'm biased. I'm so smart. All right. Not all sources are created equal. There are different kinds of sources. You've got primary sources. Primary sources are original records of events produced by people who were there. They witnessed the event. They participated maybe in the event. All right. And primary sources offer different points of views and perspectives of events that occur. So the thing you've got to remember is that primary sources were created by someone who had first-hand experience. And a lot of the time students think, well, it's a primary source, so it's got to be reliable. Not necessarily. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, it says stop. Complete your activities on page 13. So the first one, it says brainstorm possible primary sources here. So I want you to stop the video and I want you to think about what different kinds of sources are primary sources. Just type in a few. All right, when you're done, click start and we'll take a look at that. All right, so hit stop now. Thank you. All right, welcome back, my friends. You should have been brainstorming possible primary sources. See which ones you have. I'll bet you have ones that I don't. I don't know. Here's a list I came up with. Diaries of people who wrote about something that happened while they were alive or at the event. Paintings and drawings done at that time. Newspapers, if they're talking about an event that recently happened, just happened, and that, the reporter was at the scene and talked to people who were there, or the reporter maybe saw it, that makes it a primary source. Laws are always primary sources because they're written at a specific time and place for a specific society. And laws can tell you a lot about what people felt was important to them, roles of individuals in society at that time and place and location. Okay. Logs, like diaries, birth records, and death records are primary sources. Marriage records, too, primary sources. Photographs are awesome primary sources because they capture a specific moment in that time and place in history. So they don't lie. Photographs don't lie as long as they're not manipulated. All right. So those are the lists that I have. If you want to add some of mine to your list, go right ahead. I have no problem with that. All right. All right, I've got a little illustration there on the bottom of page 13, and it says, based on the illustration, what might be some limitations of primary sources? I told you, a lot of students think that just because it's a primary source doesn't mean that it's reliable. You can't write that on an enduring issues essay. Well, document 1 is a primary source, so it's very reliable when talking about blah, blah, blah. It might not be. So take a minute, read through that cartoon there, and then answer that question. Based on the illustration, what might be some limitations of primary sources? All right, so stop this video right now, examine the cartoon, and answer that question. I'll be back. All right, my sweetnesses, let's take a look. Here's what I wrote. I said some primary sources were written before modern science or modern knowledge, so they might be inaccurate if you're looking at medical texts of the ancient Greeks. Those are primary sources written at the time, but they might not be very accurate because they didn't have modern science to understand medicine and how the body works and stuff like that. Also, some of the creators of primary sources are biased. Just because someone was at an event and writes about it doesn't mean they're not biased. Doesn't mean they are leaning more one way than another. Most humans are biased. They might not think they are, but when they write about an event, they usually tend to write about it from their individual beliefs about a topic. So those are some limitations. All right, so those are primary sources. Okay, now we're going to move on to other kinds of sources. Secondary sources. So now we're on page 14 in your workbook. It says secondary sources are documents, texts, images, and objects about an event, but they're created by someone who wasn't necessarily there. Okay, usually this person, like a historian, if they're writing about an event that they didn't witness, usually they use primary sources to study, to create a secondary source. So if I'm a historian and I want to write about the Battle of Lexington and Concord, obviously I was not there. So I'm going to go try to find primary sources from people who were there. And I'm going to write about what they thought, what they believed, what they witnessed. All right, so that's a secondary source. Remember, you can stop the video to finish typing your notes, okay, whenever you need to. All right. Here's a good question. Is it better to use primary or secondary sources? Ooh, that's a good question. Personally, I like primary sources, but I like to find a variety of primary sources to see if those sources all agree on what happened at a certain event. Okay. Primary sources can be reliable. You just need to corroborate them. In other words, you need to find other people at the same event who say the same thing happened. Okay. But some secondary sources written by historians are very reliable as well. So I might look at secondary sources as well. I think it's really up to you. Okay. All right. Now you're going to brainstorm possible examples of secondary sources. So you're going to stop the video and you're going to brainstorm some secondary sources, some examples of them, okay? So press stop and I'll get back to you in a minute. All right, my darlings, it's me. I'm back. What were some examples of secondary sources that you came up with? Think about that. All right, here's what I came up with. Textbooks are secondary sources. History books written long after an event. Encyclopedias are secondary sources. You don't even know what an encyclopedia is. You're too young. I used to have to look things up in the encyclopedia. Oh my Lord, that was hard because I could not spell. So finding things in the encyclopedia, which was alphabetical, was extremely hard. And Wikipedia is also secondary. It's a secondary source. Okay. Now, what I would like you to do is check out the illustration on the bottom of page 14. And I want you to think, based on the cartoon there, what might be some limitations of secondary sources, some problems with them, problems using them. Okay, so stop the video, type in your response. When you're done, hit play. I'll be back. I'm back. Did you miss me? I missed you. All right. Some limitations of secondary sources. Well, here's what I came up with. I think that secondary sources are limited because the writer wasn't there. If they're not there, then how do we know that they got the right information about the event? So that's a limitation. All right. Also, if the writer's not an expert, then can we really trust what they're writing about? Or if they use sources that were not reliable, sources that had errors. I have read textbooks and I have found mistakes in them. Sometimes one of the writers will put the wrong date, or they might put a description of a book or something and it's the wrong book that they're describing. Well, then I'm going to be reading false information thinking that it's true. So those are some limitations on secondary sources. Wikipedia is a secondary source, and I know a lot of you like to use it, but I would not use it if you're doing research, because people can go into Wikipedia, they can change things that are written, and they might be inaccurate. So I would not necessarily trust those sources. All right. So, all right. Now we're going to play around with sources. All right. So everybody should be on page 15 in their workbook. Here's an example of what we're going to do. This slide is not in your workbook. All right. So it says, choose the best source that would help you answer this historical question. So the question is, what was life like for a cowboy driving cattle from Texas into Kansas? So I've given you two different sources. Which would be best? A map of the Chisholm Trail that shows the route taken by cattle drivers from Texas to Kansas, or a collection of photographs of cowboys driving cattle in 1880 from Texas to Kansas. So what was life like for a cowboy driving cattle from Texas into Kansas? Which source would be the best to look at for that? What do you think? A map or a collection of photographs? Because they did have photography in 1880s. What do you think? I'm thinking B. I'm thinking a collection of photographs of cowboys driving cattle would be the best source. Now, why do you think it would be the best source? I'm thinking it's the best source because what did I tell you about photographs? They don't lie if they're not doctored. Photographs tell you the real story. So I think if we were going to study what life is like for cowboys driving cattle, photographs would be a way better choice for a source than a map of the Chisholm Trail. All right. So we're going to start, again, we're on page 15 in your workbook. I'm going to give you two sources, A and B. I want you to write what source A is on the top of the chart there, it says list the two sources. So your next one source, source A, is going to be an engraving, and source B is going to be a painting. All right, so that's what we are going to do. So let's practice, okay? All right, so here we go. The historical question is, what really happened at the Boston Massacre? We want to know what happened, okay? Which would be better? Would it be better to look at an engraving of the Boston Massacre made by Paul Revere, who actually did not witness the account, but it says here that he did. Revere later sold his engraving to be used as propaganda. Propaganda is something that you use to get people to think a certain way about a topic. So he sold it to be used as propaganda to get the American colonists to turn against the British. So would you use Paul Revere's engraving, or would you use a painting of the Boston Massacre made by Alonzo Chappelle 100 years after the event occurred? Which one would you use? I would like you to stop the recording, fill in the chart on top of 15. Okay, so type in which source do you trust the most? So you're going to pick the engraving or the painting. Why do you trust this source more? Okay, and type an example. And is this a primary or secondary source? All right, so stop the video and answer those questions, okay? All right, we're back. Where'd you put? Which source do you trust the most? I picked the engraving. Even though Paul Revere didn't witness the event, he was not at the massacre. He was in Boston at the time it occurred. And even though he was using it as propaganda, it was biased, definitely biased. I might use that one over the example done 100 years later. Although, because I know source A is biased, I would definitely go look for other sources to see if they agree with Paul Revere. So I said I trusted it because Revere was in Boston at the time. So this would be a primary source because it was created at the time the Boston Massacre occurred. All right. Okay, here's our second set. So station 2. All right, the question is, who was present at the signing of the Declaration of Independence? So what source would you use? Source A is a Hollywood movie made about the Declaration of Independence in 2001. Or would you use a book written by a historian, a famous historian, who's an expert on the American Revolution, published his book in 1999. So stop the recording here and fill out your second chart on page 15. So the sources, source A is a movie, and source B is the book. All right, so fill that out and press play when you're ready to talk about it. Are you ready to talk about it? I'm ready to talk about it. I'm always ready to talk. All right, we want to know who was there at the signing of the Declaration. Would we use a Hollywood movie, or would we use the book written by a famous historian? What do you think? Did you say the book? I said the book. Oh my God, we think alike. You guys are so smart. That's why I love you. All right. Yeah, I picked the book by the famous historian. Why do I trust this source more? because if he's a famous historian, he's an expert at his job. His specialty is the American Revolution, and the Declaration of Independence was signed right at the beginning of the revolution. So obviously this historian has looked at various sources, and he has corroborated evidence, and he says, this is what happened. I trust his book more than I trust the Hollywood movie. All right, so is the book a primary or secondary source? What do you think? Primary or secondary? What's that you say? A secondary source? You are correct. Why is it a secondary source? It's a secondary source because it was not written at the time. You got it. All right, let's look at station 3. So we're going to slide 16 in your workbook. All right. Okay, what's our question? Our question is, what was slavery like in South Carolina? So we want to know what slavery, the institution of slavery, was like in South Carolina. So which source would we use? Would we use an interview with a former slave done in 1936? The interviewer was African American, and he went around collecting oral histories for the Federal Writers Project. So he went around and interviewed former slaves and wrote down what they said. So that's one source, the interview. Or would you use a taped interview with the grandchildren of former slaves completed in 1995 as part of research for a documentary film? Would you use the taped interview of grandchildren of former slaves? So you've got your taped interview and your interview of former slaves. So stop this video and fill out your station 3 chart and press start when you're done. You're done? That is awesome. I'm so glad you're done. All right, we are looking at what slavery was like in South Carolina. So which source do you trust more, source A or source B? What do you think? You said A? I said A. We are just killing it today. You got it. I would definitely trust source A. There was an interview with someone who was a slave. All right. Why do you trust this source more than the other? Why? I trust source A because this person was actually a slave. They remember what life was like as a slave. They are going to be able to tell you what life was like personally. Okay. As opposed to source B, the grandchildren of former slaves. Well, they weren't there. Yeah, they listened to their grandparents, but we don't know if they are retelling the stories that they learned, if they're retelling the stories accurately. So I don't know that I would trust source B. So is source A primary or secondary? What do you think? Oh my gosh, you're right. It is primary. Okay, you're interviewing people who were slaves. That is a primary source. Awesome. Let's go to station 6. No, 4. Sorry, 4. So we're on page 16. That's where I got the 6 from. All right, so the question we want to know is, what was the effect of the loss of the buffalo on Native American tribes in 1878? So the government sent out people to shoot the buffalo, and that had a horrible effect on the Native American tribes in 1878. So to learn about the effect on the Native Americans, would we use source A or source B? Source A is a written statement of an 80-year-old Cherokee man who actually witnessed the slaughter of thousands of buffalo. Or would you use a statement from a U.S. Army general on how the Native American people are doing He gave his statement in 1890. So you're going to stop the presentation, and source A is the Cherokee statement, and source B is the Army General. So stop the presentation and fill out that chart on the bottom of page 16. Okay, and press start when you're ready to review. I'm ready to review. Are you ready to review? You must be. You hit start. Yay. All right. We want to know how the killing of the buffalo affected Native American tribes in 1878. So which source? The statement by a Cherokee Indian who saw the slaughter of buffalo? Or would we trust a statement made by an Army general in 1890? What do you think? What's that? You say the Cherokee? Yeah, I think I would use that too. The interview with the Cherokee man. He saw the slaughter. He lived through that. He was there at the time, and he knows the effect it will have on his people. All right. Source B was written later in 1890. And it's not written from a Native American point of view. And the United States Army may want people to think a certain way about the effect that the killing of the buffalo had. So he might be extremely biased. So I said definitely source A. We want to know the effect on Native Americans. He is Native American and he lived through that. So is that written statement primary or secondary? What's that? You say primary? You are correct. It is primary. All right, let's do two more, okay? Because this is wicked fun. All right, station 5. You're on page 17 in your workbook now. All right, the question is, what was life like in western Kansas living on a homestead? A homestead's just a small farm that, someone goes out west and they buy a piece of land from the government and they start a homestead. So we want to know what life was like for those farmers. So would we look at a government film detailing the history of the Homestead Act, which provided land for people to get virtually free? Or would you use a series of letters from a woman who lived on the homestead in Kansas? She's writing letters to her family in New York. So source A is the government film and source B are the letters. So you're going to stop the presentation and you're going to type in your responses in the chart on page 17 on the top, station 5. Okay, so stop and then press start when you're done. You're done? Already? That was quick. All right, we want to know what life was like on a homestead out in Kansas. So which would you use, the government film or the series of letters? You would use the letters? I would use the letters. You are so good at this. Why would you use the letters? I would use the letters because she lived there. She lived on a homestead. She has firsthand knowledge of what life was like on her homestead in western Kansas. That definitely would beat a government film, which was made probably, 50 years later or more. So I would use the series of letters. So are those letters primary sources or secondary sources? You're right. They are primary sources. They were written at the time by someone living through that experience. Awesome job. All right. Our last example, station 6. This is our last one. So the question is, what happened at the Battle of Antietam during the Civil War, the American Civil War? The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single-day battle during the Civil War. So we want to know what happened. So would you use a high school history textbook from 1989? Or would you use a newspaper account from the day after the battle in September 1862? Which would you use? This one's a little harder. So source A is the textbook and source B is the newspaper article. So you're going to hit stop on this presentation. You're going to fill in your chart on the bottom of page 17 and then press start when you're ready to review. Welcome back, my dears. You're ready to review? All right, we want to know what happened at the Battle of Antietam. Are we going to use the high school history book, or are we going to use the newspaper account from the day after? What do you think? Personally, if you want my opinion, I know you didn't ask for it, but you're going to get it anyway. I would use the newspaper article from the next day. Why would I use that? Because it happened the day before, so the news is fresh. There were reporters who were there on the scene the next day. So I would say that that would be more reliable, maybe, than a high school textbook. I told you, I've read textbooks that have errors in them. So I personally would rather use the newspaper account. Okay? So is the newspaper account from the day after the battle a primary or a secondary source? I would say that's a primary source. I know it wasn't written at the day of the battle, but it was written the next day. So it's written at that time and place in history. It was the next day. So I think that would be pretty reliable. Oh my gosh, we've done it. We've looked at all kinds of different sources. We know the difference between primary and secondary sources. We know how we would use them. We've learned about reliability and bias. You guys are doing really well. I'm very happy and proud. All right, so I will talk to you tomorrow.